welcome to the Bible for worship at St. Paul Lutheran Church on this fourth Sunday in Lent, when our gospel reading is written in the 9th chapter of the Gospel according to St. John, verses 1 through 41. As Jesus walked along, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" Jesus answered, "Neither this man nor his parents sinned. In order that God's works might be revealed in him, we must work the works of the one who sent me while it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world." When he had said this, he spat on the ground and made mud with the saliva and spread the mud on the man's eyes, saying to him, "Go, wash in the pool of Siloam," which means sent. Then he went and washed and came back, able to see. The neighbors and those who had seen him before as a beggar began to ask, "Is this not the man who used to sit and beg?" Some were saying, "It is he." Others were saying, "No, but it's someone like him." He kept saying, "I am the man." But they kept asking him, "Then how were your eyes opened?" He answered, "The man called Jesus made mud, spread it on my eyes, and said to me, 'Go to Siloam and wash.' Then I went and washed and received my sight." They said to him, "Where is he?" He said, "I do not know." They brought to the Pharisees the man who had formerly been blind. Now it was Sabbath day when Jesus made the mud and opened his eyes. Then the Pharisees also began to ask him how he had received his sight. He said to them, "He put mud on my eyes, then I washed, and now I see." Some of the Pharisees said, "This man is not from God, for he does not observe the Sabbath." But others said, "How can a man who's a sinner perform such signs?" And they were divided. So they said again to the blind man, "What do you say about him? It was your eyes he opened." He said, "He is a prophet." The Jews did not believe that he had been blind and had received his sight until they called the parents of the man who had received his sight and asked them, "Is this your son, who you say was born blind? How then does he now see?" His parents answered, "We know that this is our son and that he was born blind. But we do not know how it is that now he sees, nor do we know who opened his eyes. Ask him, he is of age. He'll speak for himself." His parents said this because they were afraid of the Jews, for the Jews had already agreed that anyone who confessed Jesus to be the Messiah would be put out of the synagogue. Therefore, his parents said, "He is of age. Ask him." So for the second time, they called the man who had been blind, and they said to him, "Give glory to God. We know that this man is a sinner." He answered, "I do not know whether he's a sinner. One thing I do know, that though I was blind, now I see." They said to him, "What did he do to you? How did he open your eyes?" He answered them, "I've told you already, and you would not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you also want to become his disciples?" Then they reviled him, saying, "You are his disciple, but we are disciples of Moses. We know that God has spoken to Moses, but as for this man, we do not know where he comes from." The man answered, "Here is an astounding thing. You do not know where he comes from, and yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners, but he does listen to one who worships him and obeys his will. Never since the world began has it been heard that anyone opened the eyes of a person born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing." They answered him, "You were born entirely in sins, and are you trying to teach us?" and they drove him out. Jesus heard that they had driven him out, and when he found him, he said, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" He answered, "And who is he, sir? Tell me, so that I may believe in him." Jesus said to him, "You have seen him, and the one speaking with you is he." He said, "Lord, I believe." And he worshiped him. Jesus said, "I came into this world for judgment, so that those who do not see may see, and those who do see may become blind." Some of the Pharisees near him heard this and said to him, "Surely we are not blind, are we?" Jesus said to them, "If you were blind, you would not have sin. But now that you say, 'We see,' your sin remains." The Gospel of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Oh, what an amazing, rich, enlightening story this is. The story of a man born blind, one that John tells because John knows that the story can open our eyes too. This is a key to the stories in the Gospel of John. They are dramatic and they are symbolic. Here, for example, in chapter 9, verse 38, it says that the man responded to Jesus, "Lord, I believe," and he worshiped him. That would not be a plausible historical narrative in the life of Jesus or in the life of this man. Rather, the man is a model for the kind of discipleship that John, as a gospel writer, wants to show and to teach in the writing of the gospel. It is, after all, in chapter 20, verse 31 of this gospel, that the writer says, "These things have been told so that you may believe, and that believing you may have life." So the man is a symbolic disciple. In a similar way, the Pharisees or the Jews are symbolic figures of religious leadership, not specific to those who were in any office or power in the time of Jesus. And the man's parents similarly represent symbolically a segment of a community. John is creating a dramatic encounter crafted around a story, but meant to convey clearly values and ideas. A colleague by the name of Jamie Clark Solis, in her book, Reading John for Dear Life, helps us with a number of the insights that are important in this chapter. And I'll be leaning heavily on Jamie's work as I share these with you. First of all, it's important to note in verse 3 of the chapter that the emendation, the change, the editing of the NRSV that I have done reflects Jamie's work, which I find very plausible, on the Greek of that verse. If you followed in the New Revised Standard Version or some other translations, you will have seen the phrase that Jesus says, "He was born blind so that the works of God may be revealed in him." But that phrase, "he was born blind," appears in not one single ancient Greek manuscript of the Gospel of John. It has been inserted by the translators as they try to make sense of this verse. But if they have inserted it, there are other ways that one can understand the verse. And so the way that Jamie has translated it, which I have adopted, says that if you take out that phrase and you recognize that ancient Greek manuscripts had no punctuation, they didn't even separate between words. It was just one run-on line of letters, one after another, and they expected the reader to be able to divide the words, but no punctuation. And so the translation that I've incorporated here is the one that says, "It was neither he nor his parents who sinned. In order that the works of God may be made known, we must do the work of the one who sent me." And that is such a different message. Not focused back on what happened and what it might mean, but focused on the blind man presently and what is possible for his future if we are doing the works of God. That's one of the first points that Jamie makes in her commentary on this chapter, that throughout the chapter, there's a clear distinction in who focuses on what. Here is a man born blind, and when the disciples encounter him, he becomes an object of theological discussion. Was it he who sinned or his parents who sinned that he ended up blind? And frankly, the question is rather ridiculous from the outset. Not that many people haven't had that thought, that somehow illness or suffering or injury indicates that you have somehow sinned or fallen out of favor with God. But that's never how the Bible talks about God and human suffering. But that's what the disciples do. They turn the man into a case study for a theological discussion. The Pharisees, the religious leaders, again representing a particular attitude toward this, not an historical group of people, they turn it into a power struggle. Who is this fellow who did this? How did he do it? How does he relate to us and the power that we have in the community? Explain to us. And they admit they don't know where he came from, which the man himself turns into a little bit of sarcastic humor in part of the chapter. The man's parents don't focus on him and his situation, but on themselves, John says. They are asked to testify, which would be appropriate in a Jewish setting of that time. You need two witnesses to testify to any facts that are present in a case that's being decided. And so they're asked, is this your son who was born blind? And they say, yes, it's our son, and he was born blind. Well, how did he come to have his sight? We might assume that they know the answer to that, but they say, we don't know. And John says that that was their answer because they were afraid of the Jews. And again, we have that categorical, symbolic presence of a group representing some competing community group in John's day, perhaps, who had indicated that they would not accept people who confessed Christ, Jesus as the Christ. But in any case, whatever the factual accuracy of that statement, the parents clearly are symbols of those who focus not on the man and his need, but on themselves. They focus on themselves. The Pharisees focus on a power struggle. The disciples focus on a theological question. And what is it that Jesus takes as his focus? The man and his need. When Jesus sees a man born blind, knowing that God has sent him into the world to do the works of God, then the question is, what would God do with this man now? And how can I facilitate it? And the answer is an almost sacramental act of healing. Spit and mud and washing, and the man can see. Because Jesus didn't turn him into an object for debate or argument or challenge. Jesus saw him as a man of need. Another point that Jamie makes about this chapter is that story and encounter lead to deepening meaning. We see this in the way that the man born blind refers to Jesus. In verse 11, he is the man called Jesus. In verse 17, a little bit farther, he is a prophet. In verse 33, he says that surely he is a man from God. And in verse 35, Jesus asks him, do you believe in the Son of Man? And the man born blind says, well, who is he? And Jesus says, I am he. Whereupon, in verse 38, the man comes to the realization that this is the Lord. I believe, Lord, and he worshiped him. That doesn't happen when the man first is healed. He says after that, I don't know where he is. But then through the process of telling the story, of recounting what happened, of being pressed to understand what is your experience in relationship to God, he comes to realize this is the Lord to be worshiped. This is evident also in his somewhat sarcastic or sardonic response to the Pharisees who want him to tell them again what Jesus did. And he says, what? You want me to tell you again? Do you want to be his disciples? As though hearing the story once isn't necessarily going to make you a disciple. Hearing it twice, maybe, but if you want to be his disciple, you need to tell the story over and over again. And with each telling, the insight, the realization, the enlightenment, and the depth of discipleship grow greater. Finally, Jamie Clark Solis points out for us that this is a story about healing and hope, as all of the gospel stories are. It's in John 3:17 that John tells us that Jesus came into the world not to condemn the world, but in order that the world might be healed through him. And here is this powerful story of healing. And in chapter 10, verse 10, Jesus will say, I came that they may have life and life abundant. That is a word of hope. And Jamie, to whom I am deeply grateful for these insights that I can share with you, for Jamie, in her words, says, if a message about Jesus, if a message that is a gospel message, is not marked by hope, it may be many things, but it is, by definition, not Christian. Healing and hope, the promise of God in and through Christ for all God's people. God bless.